Hey everybody, welcome back after our holiday break to our next lesson. This time we are moving ahead and we are picking up with a story and a lesson about King David, which is a name that maybe you've heard before. He's kind of a big name in what we would call the Old Testament. As we start off today, as we normally do, in just a second here, I'm going to have you put me on pause and together with your families talk about your highs and lows. What's been good, what's been not so good. You're back into school now this week, so how's that going so far? And then also share together in the prayer, which, as we've done the last few times, I will include in the email, so you will have that there. Okay, that being done now, let's recap. When we left off a few weeks back before Christmas, we were focusing on Moses and the Israelites and their time of wandering in the desert, and the 40 years that they spent there after Exodus, after leaving Israel. And then we we zipped ahead a generation and we followed Joshua and the next generation of Israelites as they began to take possession of the promised land from those tribes or those other cultures that were already there. From there, we actually backed up to the beginning of the wilderness wanderings again when God gave the people, Moses, to the people, the 10 commandments, not just once, but twice, because as you remember, things got a little heated and Moses broke the first batch. So, but that's where we are now. This really brings them or guided them into their first period of being a nation, or in this earliest period, in this earliest time when they're together in the promised land. They're still very tribal. Remember, there are 12 tribes of Israel. Each one kind of operates independently, more as their own clan rather than a united nation. And they do a lot of fighting. And funny enough, they actually fight each other almost as often as they are fighting the other neighboring people or the neighboring cultures. But there's a lot of that goes on in this early time. And one of the major cultures that they fight a lot with, or the other people that they fight a lot with, is the Philistines. That's one that we hear a lot. They're just kind of a back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So with that, today we're going to fast forward actually a fairly long way. Exodus and all the wandering is thought to have happened somewhere between about 1200 to about 1500 years BCE, or before Common Era, or BC, maybe you've heard that too. So before Jesus was around. So somewhere in the vicinity of like 12 to 15 centuries before Jesus is around is where that wandering happened. Now, David's story, or David becomes king right about the year 1000 BCE. So we've got a gap of somewhere between like 200 to 500 years, or this window, depending on what historian you talk to, from when this happens. Now, during this time, sometimes the Israelites did a pretty good job of following God and staying faithful to God and honoring God and following the 10 Commandments. Sometimes not so good. During this time, they also intermingled a lot with the other neighboring cultures. Sometimes they fought them. Sometimes they actually got along and they intermingled with them and they married across those cultural lines, even though God had told them they probably shouldn't do that. They did it anyway. So we get a lot of this back and forth that goes on, and not only culturally, but also in their worship. And so this brings other gods, idols, false gods, into the whole matters of faith. A lot of different ones, but a big one, an important one that we hear a lot through this time is Baal, or Baal. Sometimes you hear it pronounced those different ways, but that's one of the major false gods that we hear a lot about. They kind of go on this crazy cycle through this time, is what I call it. They sort of turn their backs on God, kind of go their own way, do whatever they feel like. God then kind of returns the favor and removes God's favor from the people. And then things kind of start to go not so good, and a neighboring culture will kind of take them over and lead them or conquer them even. And things go poorly for a while. And then the people like remember God. And they're like, oh, wait a minute. And they cry out to God and they ask for deliverance, sort of like we heard in the 400 years between Genesis and Exodus, right? And then God raises up a leader for them who will lead them and free them and protect them from their oppressors. And then that person leads them until that person dies. and then the crazy cycle just sort of repeats over and over again. These leaders were called judges. And if you're familiar, there is an Old Testament book called Judges, and it features a lot of these different stories and a lot of these different leaders. And there were a bunch of them. Now, some of them are pretty well known, like Samson, who, if you remember, was super strong because of his long hair, and Gideon, who is kind of another big name that we know about. Deborah, yes, there were some female judges too, which is cool. They're some of the bigger names, but then there's a bunch of other ones too. So if you're interested, read the book of Judges. There's some interesting stories in there. At the same time that we had the judges, we also had prophets. Now, this is a word that maybe you've heard before. Prophets were the ones who spoke for God. They were like the voice of God to the people. Sometimes when things weren't going so great and the people were downtrodden, they would bring a message of hope for the people, of reassurance. At the same time, sometimes when they were feeling kind of high and mighty and they were sort of turning their backs on God, the prophets would bring a word of warning or a word of rebuke to them. So we had prophets and we had judges during this period. Sometimes they sort of worked hand in hand together. Sometimes they sort of butted heads with one another for what was best for the people. So that's just kind of what we saw through this period. Prophets, judges. Question for you. I want you to write this down and record this. What seems to be the same, or how do they compare, prophets and judges? Like, what do they have in common, and maybe what don't they have in common? So talk about that, record that, and we'll move on. Okay. Now, in our story, this brings us to a guy named Samuel. Now, we pick up in Samuel's story when he's actually very, very young, even before he's born. He was both a prophet and a judge. He actually filled both roles, interestingly enough. He was raised in a house of God, not the temple, but in a house of worship by a priest. He becomes people recognize that the Spirit of God is with him. He becomes a judge, and he serves as a judge in his younger years. And then as he gets a little bit older, he really takes on more of the prophet role, speaking for God as opposed to leading for God. But that's kind of what he does. He does both. Through Samuel, God talks to the people, and the people at this point, they're getting jealous of the cultures that are around them. They see other nations, they see other kingdoms, they see people with a king and these strong leaders, and they're like, we want a king. We don't have a king, we should have a king. These judges just aren't cutting it. God, give us a king. And so God speaks through Samuel and says, basically, you don't need a king to lead you. I lead you. I care for you. I direct you. You don't need a king. But they're like, yeah, we still think we do. So God's kind of like, well, fine. You want a king? Fine. Here's what that's going to look like. They're going to take advantage of you. In the long run, you're not going to be happy. They're not going to treat you equally. They're going to take advantage of you just like the people did, or the Pharaoh did back in Egypt. Things will get cyclic because we kind of keep seeing the same thing over and over again, don't we? Mark my words, that's what's going to happen, and it does in the long run. But God says, you want a king? I'll give you a king. God appoints a young man named Saul as the first king. He was a strong leader. He began to unite the 12 tribes. He didn't completely unite them, but he started working on bringing some unity into the 12 tribes, and he established the first kingdom. Now, in the email that I sent you, there's a picture that is a map, and it's got 3 different colors on it. It's got yellow, green, and then red. Saul's kingdom that he controlled is the yellow part. So I want you to go ahead and reference that. You can kind of see what we're talking about. But so he begins the process of creating the nation of Israel. God sends Samuel, I got a lot of the same names here, Samuel to anoint Saul now as leader. Now, the anointed one, this is God's chosen person to lead. And there is a specific word for this or name for this. In the Hebrew language, this is Messiah. Perhaps you've heard that before. There's also a Greek word that I'm betting you've heard before, Christos or Christ. Interesting. Kind of sounds like Jesus, right? And yeah, it does. But in the history, there were messiahs. There were God's anointed, chosen leaders, and they were usually the kings, the ones chosen to lead politically. And then Jesus is something different. But that's some foreshadowing. So isn't that interesting that we had messiahs, God's chosen ones, even before Jesus? I think that's pretty cool. Okay. Now, Saul, let's get back to him. he reigned as king for about 40 years, give or take a little bit. During Saul's reign, that's when David, who we're actually going to talk about in the long run, he comes on the scene as a young man. He's maybe like early teenage years. He's really not very old when we first encounter him. Now, Saul had his strengths, and he did. He was a decent military leader, but he also had issues. He was kind of paranoid, especially in his older years. And some of these issues that go on, Samuel, who's still around, really kind of takes issue with, and he begins to grieve Saul becoming king. Now, here's our first scripture reading that I want you to pick up. I want you to find 1 Samuel. There are 2 different books of Samuel, and they're back to back. So 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 through 5. So go ahead and read that. Okay. During this, God tells Samuel, we'll anoint a new king. Quit worrying about Saul. We'll anoint a new king. A son of Jesse of Bethlehem, the community of Bethlehem. So Samuel goes off and finds Jesse, and Jesse begins to bring his sons in. He's got a whole slug of sons. Starts with the oldest one first, and God's like, nope, not him. And then the next one, nope, not him. Nope, not him. Nope, not him. All the way down through. And we get through them. Now, fast forward just a few verses. Now read verses 10 through 13. Here's David's first appearance. He's the youngest brother. Have we heard that before? Youngest, which makes like he's as far away from the chosen oldest heir as possible. And that's the one God chooses. Interesting. We also hear about that he's the youngest brother. He's the shepherd for his dad's sheep. And apparently he's quite the looker. I don't know why that's important, but apparently it is. And we hear about that. Now I want you to back up to verse 7. Go back and read verse 7 again. Well, not again. You haven't read it yet. Go back to verse 7 and read that. And here's a question for you. I want you to write this down. What does God look for instead of the outward appearance? Okay. We hear that David has, at this point, I mean, he's young. He's got no military experience. He's got no leadership experience. But God sees David's love for God, his adoration of God, and chooses him. And with that, Samuel anoints David as the future ruler. But we've got a lot of ground to cover before he actually becomes king. Now, in the meantime, the next chapter, chapter 17, is the story of David and Goliath, which perhaps you're familiar with. I hope you are. If not, go back and read it because it's wonderful. But if you are familiar with it, you know what's going on. Goliath is the Philistine champion, and they're button heads right now. And basically they come out in the battlefield and he says, hey, send out your best warrior to fight me. And if I kill him, you become our slaves. And if he kills me, we'll become your slaves. And this goes on every day for like a month and a half, like 40 days. And everybody, all the Israelites are scared. They don't want to go out and face him because he's a giant. They're like, he'll kill us. It won't be cool. And then David shows up, and David's still a kid. And David's like, why is this guy squawking? Why are we worried about him? What's the issue here? We have God on our side. Anyone could kill him. I could kill him. And they all laugh at him, but they're like, well, go ahead if you want to try. And he picks up his sling and stones, and he throws a stone through the sling, hits Goliath in the head, kills him. David cuts his head off with his own sword. They win. Yay. The Philistines get freaked out and run away. Cool. With this, David is now exposed to King Saul, who's still king, and enters into his service. Eventually, he gains a lot of favor. He continues to find the favor of Saul. He marries one of Saul's daughters. He forms a very close personal bond with Saul's son, Jonathan, that we hear about off and on for a while. He becomes very important. And as time goes on, he becomes a great military leader, and his skill and his popularity with the people keep going up. So we've got Saul, who was here, and now all of a sudden everybody's paying attention to the Wonder Kid, and he's getting more attention. David's getting more attention than Saul. Saul takes issue with this. He changes his mind, and he tries to have David killed, not just once, but multiple times. He even tries to kill him himself several times over. Question: why would Saul want David killed? What do you think? Go ahead and record that. Okay. Moving on. throughout this entire period, and it lasts for quite a while. David actually has the opportunity to kill Saul several times over, but he refuses every time. And his reason for it, David says, I can't kill him. This is God's anointed one. Even though he, David, was also anointed to be the next king, he says, this is the one that God has chosen. I am not, who am I to kill God's chosen one? So he refuses. But in the long run, Saul gets killed anyway because he goes into a tent of this random woman and he falls asleep. He says, don't tell anyone I'm here, but she knows who he is, and she takes a tent peg and like smacks it through his head and kills him. Whoa, weird, right? But that's the story. So he gets killed. And now with this, that takes us from 1 Samuel into 2 Samuel. Remember, I said there's 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. Now we're into 2 Samuel. David becomes the king of Judah, not Israel, Judah. Now, if you remember correctly, Judah is one of the tribes of Israel. It's one of the 12 tribes. It's actually the largest one. Their tribe controlled the most land, and they're kind of centered around that southern area, what we now call Israel, which is actually Saul's stomping grounds, interestingly enough. Time passes. David continues to become stronger. His popularity with all of the tribes continues to grow as the popularity and the strength of Saul's followers, and there still are some, that begins to diminish. So they're getting weaker. David's getting stronger. Eventually, he is just the one who becomes king. I want you to read now 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 1 through 16. So put me on pause and go ahead and read that. Okay. He finally unites the 12 tribes. If you look back at that picture of the map that I told you about, the green portion, and then also the yellow portion, that is David's kingdom. So you can see that he expands Saul's kingdom quite a bit compared with what Saul had first done. He also moves the capital to Jerusalem, which is a city that's kind of right smack dab in the middle, making it accessible to everyone. With this, things continue to go well for David. Things are just going well. God continues to be with him. Even though he's not a perfect person, God still is with him and continues to bless all that David is doing. At this certain point now, God tells David, hey, I want a temple. They're still using the tabernacle. There's some other houses of worship that are in different areas, but God said, like, I want a temple. Build a temple to me in Jerusalem. Or he's giving him plans, I should say. He actually doesn't tell David, build a temple. He gives him plans for the temple. And in the midst of it, God makes a promise. Now, I want you to read 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 through 16. Put me on pause. Go ahead and read that. The promise is your descendant will be sitting on the throne. Now, here's the question. There are two people that this is referring to. There's actually two different correct answers here. One of them is Solomon, who is going to be, or who is one of the sons of David, or will be one of the sons of David. That's one person that God is referring to here, but there's another one. Here's the question. Who is that other person? Do you know? And I'll give you a hint. It's the church answer. Interesting. Okay. Time goes on. David continues to be a good king. He's faithful to God, but he still has issues because everyone does, right? We continue to see that over and over and over again. I want you to read now 2 Samuel 11, 2 through 5. Go ahead and read that. As we see, David basically sees a woman that he wants, doesn't care who she is, brings her into brings her into his house and just takes her. That's not cool, right? Right. It's not cool. She's also pregnant and she's also married. Not good. They call that adultery. Bad things. Don't do it. Bad things. David's kind of freaking out now. So now he's trying to cover his tracks because not only has he committed adultery, but she's pregnant. So there's evidence of it. So he brings Uriah. Uriah is the husband and is actually a member of his military. Brings him home, hoping that a little bit of rest and relaxation time with Uriah and his wife will result in David's issues being covered up. Think the birds and the bees, and you'll be correct here. But it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work out. Uriah is a man of honor, and he's like, how can I go home when my men are still out on the battlefield? So he doesn't go home. And so now David is basically having to think fast again. And so he writes a letter to the generals of the army and says, basically, put Uriah on the front lines and then everybody back away from him so he'll get killed in the fighting. He seals the letter and he gives it to Uriah to carry to the general. So basically, he's given Uriah his own death note. And this is exactly what happens. So Uriah goes into battle, gets killed. David, this great king who loves God, has now committed adultery, and in order to cover his tracks, has committed conspiracy to murder. Beautiful, right? Evidence further, the same thing. that even the God's chosen ones, the ones God uses, are not perfect people, and they have their problems. Okay. With all this going on, once this has happened, David then brings Bathsheba into his home. Bathsheba is the woman. He marries her, but the baby eventually dies. And before even that had happened, this prophet called Nathan comes to David and basically tells him a story that's calling him on the carpet. Hey, you have sinned. You have done wrong. You need to repent of it, which he does. But the baby, who's the result of the sin, dies anyway. And we've seen this sort of thing before. In fact, I've said it just in the last 15 seconds. God uses imperfect people. God calls and uses people who have problems because none of us are perfect. And that's really our takeaway. Okay. We've seen this before. We're going to see it again. So here, as we're wrapping up now, here's the last couple of questions, the same type of thing we wrap up with every time. What's the most surprising thing about this story? I think that, I mean, there's a lot going on here. I know I've been talking for a while. What's the most surprising thing about either what you read or what I described to you? Anything weird? Anything you can relate to? And then any other questions or comments or concerns or thoughts that you have. Go ahead and put all that down. I look forward to hearing from you. Take care, everybody.